Hello, everybody, and welcome to another episode of Generally Casual, the place where you can learn everything and anything casually. I'm Michael, and I'm joined with your co-hosts, Richard and Corey, and we're all not Michael this week.
Good to be here.
Yeah, it's good to be here.
I feel like we need to always open with some like radio host little.
Thanks for the intro.
Thanks for coming.
Corey,
I'm happy to be here.
would you say we would do that eternally?
I would say that. Yeah.
So, in line with what we had talked about on the We Stat Ourselves episode, we are taking this approach of big topics we can talk about going into Thanksgiving about with families.
Yep.
So we did the stats aspect 2 weeks ago. We did Dune last week, and now we're doing Eternals this week. So two big movies.
Because it's relevant.
Also, we didn't talk about during the Dune movie, but it's relevant because you can go see movies with your family, and that's always
true.
really easy to see.
Yeah, it's great. It's in the dark. They're quiet.
Mm-hmm. The Spider-Man movie's coming out in December, unless you're listening to this in January. Then it already came out. Hey!
Yeah. And then you get to know what we know before we do now, but then.
Time reversal. Hey, everybody, welcome back to November. This is Generally Casual.
When will then be now? Or now be then?
When now is there.
Yeah.
Then
So, with
now.
the eternal question of when will now be then, we're talking about the
Double
Eternals. Because as a franchise, it's definitely one of the lesser known, at least for me, Marvel aspects, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like, I didn't know anything about it before I heard it was going to be a movie. There's actually, like, surprisingly little about the Eternals outside of the key Eternals.
That's true.
Being the ones mainly featured in the movie.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, and as we'll let it known during our research, there is also very little known, like, even with specific characters, like, they are touched on heavily and then they're just gone.
Yeah.
So
And the weird, I guess, thing about it is based off of what the research I did. They all have kind of interchangeable powers, but then there are focuses for each of them.
So what's interesting, and I think maybe that's a good way to start it,
we're
is
explaining Eternals.
the Eternals, the interchangeability of it makes sense because of the fact of how the Eternals came to be.
Yes.
Because their powers don't matter. It's just the fact that there are a set of people called the Eternals, and they were created by these guys called the Celestials.
And I think what may be really important for anybody who's listening to this one specifically for this information, why don't we touch on lightly what's different from the movie? We're not going to be spoiling or explaining the movie at all, but we
As
can
much
talk
as we
about
can.
we can talk about how the movie versions of these characters are a bit different, and then we can jump into a full, like, our research explains.
Yeah.
Well, yeah.
Mainly because I think all of our research can explain what was different from the movie since we just watched it a few days ago. And I think number one for me, I don't know about for you guys, is that in the comics, they're not robots.
Yes, that was one of the weird things I found about the movie, because I was like, do they really even have to be robots? But, like,
Even still, they technically talk, and even in the movie, it's kind of nebulous. They talk about they were created, and they use lots of
the
mechanical
imagery they use is mechanical.
imagery.
Yeah.
However, like, you could technically understand why they went that direction, because in the comic lore, they were created. They were not, like,
Yes.
birthed.
But because the Celestials, being all-powerful beings that they were just like, we give birth to this mostly organic thing because these things can give birth. And in the movie, it really feels like they can't.
Yeah.
Which makes, like, other things that are literally explained in the same movie going, wait, I thought Thanos was... What?
Yeah.
What?
Which is, it leads into, like, the beginning part of my research. Because that is kind of where I did my research based around, was leading up to essentially the movie-ish sort of thing happening.
Well, I think that's the biggest difference, so let's just jump right into it.
Yeah, so essentially there are these beings called the Celestials, and they're like primordial beings or gods that have essentially existed since the very dawn of anything.
They were the first life form, basically.
And they essentially take energy from the universe and combine it to make stars and planets, and they are the ones that help bring life in. And then essentially they had a bunch of planets that they seeded with the beginnings of life, and Earth was one of them. And in my research that I was doing, which obviously comes from a very specific viewpoint of canon, because there's like 4 main different branches of canon when it comes to the Eternals.
There's multiple Earths.
But with these Eternals, essentially there were the apes that formed, and then there are humans, and in the middle are considered the Wanderers. And in Marvel lore, it's these Wanderers that the Eternals come onto Earth. They're like, oh, look at this. They grab them, and then 3 separate factions of Eternals, of Celestials, take these Wanderers. One faction takes them and experiments on them, and they become the Deviants. The second faction takes them, and they become Eternals. And the third faction takes them and experiments on them and finds out and messes with a hidden gene or a recessive gene. And that is to do with the X-Men and
the mutants and the Inhumans.
And Hulk and anyone, Spider-Man, like anyone who essentially gets bitten or radioactive by something, it activates that gene that guy specifically worked on, and that is to do with those sets of guys.
Quick further explanation with that. The 3 groups, Eternals, Humans, and Deviants, the middle one being Humans, have that latent gene, and each one of them was worked on by a different Celestial, which have names and other titles to them,
which
but that doesn't matter. Who cares?
No,
because it really, like, when researching the Celestials, it really doesn't matter who they are. Like, really doesn't.
And so kind of to go a little bit further also, the whole reason that this whole thing exists is because they wanted to basically have a very, very back-end lore for Marvel. They're like, we need origin stories for origin stories for origin stories. And that's pretty much what this is.
Let me add on to before Corey, like what happened before Corey's history. So keeping it light is right before the Celestials existed. There used to be one thing called the Firmament, which was basically OG Universe, but it was alone and had nothing else. Which beyond the one above all, the one below all, and all these other people who are super powerful in the Marvel Universe, one above all being like literally the epitome of power, like God itself. But there was the Firmament, and then the Firmament was like, I'm alone. I'm going to make these things called the Attunement or something like that. Basically a word for meaning Celestials, but loyal to itself. And then those broke off into what would be known as the Celestials today. They had a war. The war got so bad that it literally exploded the first entity, the Firmament, and all of its Celestials that were loyal to itself into the new multiverse. Like, literally exploded a reality into a new reality. And then we get up to the Celestials going, let's go dork around with some life and stuff, and they eventually got to Earth. And here is a fun part, is right after they started messing around with that, there was these things called the hosts, and I think that's what we're leading into with, I think if you guys did research on the hosts.
So they called them the hosts because it was that each time they visited Earth, they would call it
and
the host.
Earth being a giant experiment like Corey was talking about. So the first host is when they messed around with the Eternals, the Humans, and the Deviants in the first place. Also, another difference from the movie, the Deviants were actually some kind of sentient race that actually could think.
Yeah,
and
they
were
humanoid, taking over.
Yes.
What was interesting, the biggest thing that like was a difference that I noticed was that like there was the whole thing where Eternals were meant to be protectors of humanity, like it is in the movies, but the Deviants also existed on the surface of Earth at the same time and enslaved humanity. And the Deviants actually built the city of Atlantis. And when the Celestials came back and they're like, what the heck is going on? Like, you guys messed up the place. Humanity's enslaved. The Eternals are just doing their own thing. They don't care. And the Deviants are controlling them. So the Deviants were forced to essentially sink their home city, which was Atlantis. And then the Celestials are like, now, bad. Now we're going to leave. And when we come back, you better fix this.
So Corey just explained the second host. So the second host, basically, there was a massive civil war before the Celestials came back between the Eternals and the Deviants. They basically, the Eternals had a civil war between them, wiped nearly all of them out. Then the Deviants had a war with the Eternals, and they wiped out a lot of Deviants. And then they were basically just going, oh my God. And that's when the Celestials showed up going, what are you doing? Figure it out, or we'll come back and kill all of you.
Yeah,
and
and-
wipe Earth clean and restart our experiment. And that's when they were like, the Eternals and Deviants were like, okay, we got to stop messing around with each other because we don't all want to die.
Yeah, they essentially called like a ceasefire. And then like, I think there were like 2 main brother Eternals, and one went to the moon Titan, and then the other one stayed on Earth, and that's how it kind of got sectioned out. But I found also that the Skrull are a
Experiment
by
so
the
are
Celestials.
the Kiar.
the She.
Sheet.
The Shi'ar?
Yeah.
I think that's it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's the thing. It's like there's multiple planets that are influenced by, obviously, the Celestials in general, but by the Eternals as well.
Mm-hmm.
And like they're kind of mutated over the evolution of those races by their direct influence, basically.
What's weird about the Skrull too is it's like they were affected by the Celestials, which made them more warlike, and then they almost died off.
The Kree is another
Oh,
one.
the
Yeah,
Kree,
the
yeah.
Kree. Yeah,
Um,
well, they had the whole battle with the Kree,
Yeah.
and then that they decided to be good, and then bad, and then good again, and then
So during this time before the third host happened, because you have to use these hosts as basically explaining the Eternals
Time
themselves.
period.
Yes.
Yeah.
We had one of the Eternals called Gilgamesh, who went and did the heroic Gilgamesh stuff, started a city, did all that stuff.
Babylon.
Gave birth to several other heroes. During this time, the Eternals started to work with the Olympian gods, who were other superhumans that lived on the planet.
well, the Greek pantheon.
Yeah, the
right?
Greek pantheon.
Yeah.
And also during this time is when the other, like, called the Sky Fathers came, like, they all were like, whoa, this place is called Earth. This is awesome. And they all started chilling on Earth and, like, dealing with it. Odin and his son Thor started chilling there. Like, all these other, like,
Which they
different
literally just threw out in the movie. I love that.
Yeah. All
They're
these,
like, oh, yeah, Thor.
all these different pantheons basically took home. They lived other places, but they like to spend time on Earth.
They had guardianship of Earth, essentially.
Yeah.
Well, I actually like that the fact that they've brought Eternals into the canon MCU universe is nice because it explains a lot of things, like why these pantheons, especially like Thor and Odin, were involved in humans and then disappeared for a long time and came back.
Absolutely.
Was essentially because the Celestials were like, you Skyfathers, no, you're messing up our experiment with humans. Stop involving yourself with them, otherwise we're going to cause you trouble.
And that's the third host. Basically, the Celestials came back a third time going, let's see how our experiment is going. I hope they're not fighting anymore because we'll wipe them all out. And that's when they found that all these
Gods,
all these
essentially.
gods are chilling on Earth, and they basically had a war with the Celestials. It wasn't a war because the Celestials kicked their butt.
The crap out of them.
And then they were like, you leave the planet and stay off the planet. And it just feels like the Celestials are babysitters who like bad babysitters. They come back and go, hey, get out of here.
What are you doing? What are you doing? Get out.
The way that as I was reading through everything, it made me think of like the Celestials are just trying to run their little ant farm, and some critters just keep on getting into the ant farm, and they're like, how many times do I need to clean up this stupid ant farm? They're
like-
getting new sand every time. They're getting the ants back in. They're dusting up the
We got to
the little
reset this
room.
back to control. Come on.
Yeah. And so, again, we're briefly explaining. There's a lot of stuff that happens in all this.
Oh, yeah.
And then finally, there's the fourth and the fifth hosts that are both basically judgments for Earth itself. The fourth host, I think, is when the Avengers teamed up with like everybody and fought the Celestials, lost. But then the Celestials were like, okay, we kind of approve. You can run the planet.
And wait, was that the fourth host was when Arishem came and judged?
Yes.
And then the fifth host is
It's something. That's more like the fifth host is like the most modern one.
Right, is the updated one.
Yeah, they came back again, and I'm not entirely sure, but at that point, that's well into modern storytelling, which
the fourth host is technically the important one in terms of our discussion.
and it has to do with the movie.
It's
Like that's basically
technically-
what the fourth host was.
Yes.
Where the movie's been adapted from and
right.
most recognizable.
Exactly. And with all these hosts, there was another notable celestial who was basically the executioner. So Reshiram was apparently the judgment or the judge of planets.
Arishem
Yeah,
is the
Arishem was the
judge.
judge. And if they were not approved, then would come in the celestial who's the executioner. I forgot that person's name.
I don't remember either.
But that's basically who the Celestials are. They're a group of incredibly godly beings. And another difference is like their size. They can appear as any size. As an example, in Guardians of the Galaxy, Nowhere is the head of one, which is actually cool. Way back in the beginning, one of the Celestials got their head like sliced off, and then that's where Nowhere is.
That's so cool.
Which they actually talk about in Guardians of the Galaxy. When they go to Nowhere, they talk about how it's a head of a celestial.
And so they're actually legitimately that big, but whenever they appear to worlds, they don't appear that big.
No, in terms of what the comic books, what Marvel specifically says is their height is 2,000 feet tall.
Which is really, really big.
It's
but
big.
They are technically as big as they would like to be.
Right. I mean, technically, if we go that route, also Galacticus is the same thing. He can be as small or as big as he wants
But
to
he
be.
is bigger than planets
Right.
normally.
Right.
So that brings us out of our base conversation Celestials because the Eternals existed throughout this entire time.
Right.
Before we move on, that was actually a good point that I wanted to mention, and I've been thinking about it. It's like
I guess
it
there's one
kind
more
of
thing, too.
feels like Galacticus is almost like a weapon to counter the Eternals,
So,
because he does the opposite of what the Eternals does.
Yes.
more or less, he
Okay.
actually brings balance to everything. That's
So-
his point.
Speaking of actually great jumping off point, Corey, we'll get right into that. So, in relationship to the history that it is in the movie specifically, the movie is an offshoot of the Celestials' like background that was like, I think this is the 2017 comic that talks about like this specific telling of what the Celestials do. The Celestials also, in a different history, go around to planets and call them seed planets, as we said before. But in this version, they implant a small part of a Celestial inside of a planet and basically wait eons until it's born and breaks out. So that has to do with the movie now, and Galacticus in this other realm would go around and eat those planets that would be seeded by the Celestials as a counterforce to what the Celestials are.
Well, and actually, there's a whole opposing force actually in Marvel Comics that's opposing to the Celestials as well.
Yeah.
And I don't remember what they're called, but
Dark goop.
and basically the Celestials and this other race have an eternal battle that the Celestials basically won, but they still exist because they're a counterforce. So Celestials are creators, and there are another race that are destructors, basically. That actually harkens back to the original two, which is eternal and death. Or not eternal, eternity and death.
Yes.
Because they're the opposing forces.
And
Then Galacticus is the balance between those two.
Well, Galactus is also a counterbalance in in the main canon for the Great Creator, who I won't spoil unless you want to read comics, but is really interesting. Has to do with like Reed Richards and like other people in the comic line that talk about where Galactus is from. That's all really awesome.
Proto universe, like
Yeah,
goes
all of it's
way,
really
way back.
cool. Like Galactus is a great villain and bad Fantastic Four movie for ruining him.
Which
but
I mean, they may bring him back, honestly.
also speaking with this is there's another Celestial that mattered sort of. I'm going to talk about two. There was one old Celestial who apparently was diseased, died on Earth, and then that is sort of the reason why they have superpowers. Like in an alt timeline.
You're talking about the whole thing with the Horde, or what do you?
No, sort of, yes. Is that there was a Celestial long time ago who got infected with like this disease, apparently with a Horde or whatever that is.
That's like
And
their
then
counter.
came to Earth and then died. And then this is the alt explanation of why everybody on Earth is special and why it's such a special place. Is because it's the
That
only
does have to
place
do
where
with that.
Celestial died.
Yeah, so
Oh my
Except
one of the
Noah.
things
If you're
that
still
they
following
talk
along,
about.
congratulations.
One of the things that they talk about is the humans are the cure for the Horde, and the Horde is technically the death of the Celestials. The Horde is this like alternate race that can basically feed from energy, and they can kill Celestials by just feeding on them, basically.
Yeah. And this is also why this is difficult to follow, because like an original like canon timeline that you can follow, there's a lot of this left out.
Yeah.
It's just like Celestials that go around, they do stuff. But then when they tried to reinvent that wheel and retell the timeline, then they made all this other stuff, which has to do with them seeding planets, making new Celestials, the Horde. Like, it's like a whole bunch of crazy stuff that was just really too much. It was like, it's odd because they've had their story retold like 3 or 4 times, the Celestials specifically, and each time just made it more confusing.
That was one thing I noticed when I was researching it, was it's interesting to find something that has such a niche sort of development and like end game for characters, like, because they all tend to have the same main Eternals, but there's such diversity and complexity in the backstory of it all.
Yeah.
I think it's because what ends up happening is as per normal, there ends up being popular characters. They're like, we're going to focus in on this one character because you can't really do... You can over the course of time, but when something is not A-list, right? Because technically the Eternals is not A-list.
No, it's really exciting for comic people, but the average person would not know about these people.
No. So then you have to pick and choose, like, okay, how far can we go backstories into each of these individual characters? Well, we're going to take the most popular ones and create backstories for them rather than every single Eternal.
Absolutely.
You could literally pluck anyone with any specific ability, because what I found interesting about that second group that the Celestials took is essentially what makes them Eternals is they're just essentially, according to the comics, humans that have been infused with celestial energy,
and
they can use
really
that
long.
and that literally makes them immortal because they're powered by just the fact that they exist and the universe exists.
Absolutely.
They're essentially like human batteries, which makes a lot of sense as well when you mention like when they seed planets. That's essentially what they want. They want life to propagate so that these individual human cells or alien cells can then be absorbed by the planet in the emergence, which is when the newborn celestial absorbs all that life to start their own Star Forge, essentially.
Which is a whole... So you actually talked about...
It's a separate... Like, those are two separate stories.
I was going to say...
Putting Celestials into planets and then just whatever the previous thing with the hosts, those are two separate
things.
Like, two separate timelines.
And the funny thing is the whole thing... Because they named the Celestial Tiamut, the Communicator, who's the Dreaming Celestial. That's a completely different thing, too.
Yeah, that's its own third thing.
Yeah.
Which is to be honest... slightly spoiler for the movie, that they just named the one in the movie that, and then it completely stopped having reference unless it's going to come back later in the story as the Dreaming Celestial. It seems like they were like, and here it is, and we're done with
they more or less did do, like, based off of what I read about that specific Celestial, they kind of did it. It's just different.
And the Tiamat,
they adapted it.
Had a long history of like coming back and leaving and coming back and leaving.
Well, and then he actually they actually have it where he's underneath San Francisco.
Yeah. And
sleeping.
And that's again underneath just San Francisco.
Right.
That doesn't seem like it's going to blow up the planet.
No.
But like this Dreaming Celestial was basically punished at some point for its wrongdoings.
Right.
By other Celestials going, you messed up. We're going to banish you into this planet because you're awful.
Right.
And then at times... And this is where we can go into the Eternals explanation, because this is where the Unimind came in.
Right.
So at some point, the Eternals all banded together, make a Unimind. Their brain is all connected, and they're super powerful now to put this thing back to sleep so it didn't ruin everything.
Which is really funny because, according to what I read, basically, they kind of left them alone for a bit. They're like, here, you do your thing. We got other stuff to deal with.
Yeah.
And then they came back and they're like, all right, now we're going to put you to sleep.
Yeah. So... Unless you guys have anything else you guys wanted to flesh out with the Celestials.
Well, not really. What I actually wanted to go into was kind of what we talked about at the beginning, is how the Eternals have these like powers, but and we kind of go down the list. Each one of them technically has multiple kind of powers, but they put their focus into something to be the best at it. So the main kind of Eternal from the movie is Cersei, and in the comics she's a he, but in the movie
Doesn't matter.
she's a she.
Doesn't matter at all.
It doesn't. But-
whoever was born to a different Eternal. So
What
that's
I
an
what I
important thing,
think
too.
is very interesting is that it makes sense in terms of the movie, because based off of the Marvel website, Cersei is the most human of the Eternals and the youngest and most fun living. But either way, Cersei is a she. I'm thinking of a different Makari is who I was thinking of. But either way, it's interesting because you see throughout the entire thing that she focuses on that one power in the comics, and she becomes this like very advanced user of the enchanting and conjuring stuff, and like she advances.
Well, what was really interesting, I thought too, was like I loved, first of all, that they're all they're named in ways that like crops up in history in some way or another, but with different spelling. But like you can also see that their powers influence a lot of the belief systems throughout the ages. So her power in the movie specifically is very, very similar to what someone would perceive alchemy to be.
Yeah.
Because she transmutes one thing into something else. And that was really cool in the movie, seeing her like literally collapse things into sand or form things. And at one moment I'm like, oh, well, she mentioned she can't affect living things. So I was like, that means she can't turn non-living things into living things. But there's one scene where she just turns something into butterflies. And I was like, that's really cool. But
Oh yeah.
There's a scene from the trailer, which is where she transmute a bus, and there was a guy in the bus, and immediately going, "What happened to the guy? What happened to the guy?" And then the guy's like, "Oh, I'm here."
and she transmuted a bus into flowers, and
Yeah.
it's just like a pile of flowers.
it was like, what's going on?
Yeah.
But I loved that like there was a moment where Athena gets called Athena, and she's like, drop the A.
Yeah.
That's
I don't
not
like-
me.
That's
Which
not
is
me.
also
But-
funny because there was a little history in there with the comics, is that when the Olympians were around, they were like dealing with them, is that she would be with Athena, and she took that name later to
Well,
represent.
she had a child, and I think the child's last name was Athena
Yeah.
as well.
She also took the name Athena instead of Athena as a tribute to the Olympian god, because eventually they agreed the Olympians should just stay away from with the third host and all that. She's like, okay, we Eternals will be the representatives of you on Earth.
Right.
And then people just started worshiping them instead.
So yeah, that Athena is a very interesting character as well. She seems to be very emotionally battled in the movie, which was cool. Her power in terms of the movie is that she can basically conjure ethereal weapons and armor, basically. She can create a shield and swords and pikes and all sorts of different things, and they all spawn from her hands. The next one, who in terms of the movie is kind of the leader, is Ajak. She is known in the comics as the Knower. She once fought in the Trojan War in terms of the comics, and was confused for the warrior Ajax. And then in terms of this, he flexes his strength against fellow god Thor. So I believe that's what they mention in the movie, is like, oh yeah, I remember Thor. I had a brief run-in with him, basically.
And in the movie, I think that was one of my criticisms that I had with that character specifically, was that
Just
you
being
don't
able to heal.
Well, yeah, she is only shown healing, and then her other special thing is that she communicates with Arishem.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that's it. It's like she's the leader, but she's kind of like the least important feeling.
Because and to me, it seems like she's used mostly as a plot device,
Also-
not necessarily.
Yeah.
as-
Also, what a weird thing is that she's the healer, and all of the Eternals are like, oh yeah, come heal me, like I'm injured, and it's like, with her being there, made all the rest of them feel weaker because they needed to go to her each time for healing instead of just like them being godly and having that power immediately.
I would say that the first interaction between her and Icarus was interesting because she healed him of her own volition, and he basically said thank you, but it wasn't like a begging thing.
Yeah.
like she walked by him and just was like, here, heal, and he was like, oh, thank you. I guess I needed that.
Yeah.
That's the issue that I have, is like that's the only thing that she's shown doing, and outside of that, she's portrayed less of a leader and more of a mother figure.
Mm-hmm.
Which leads into you saying it's a plot device, because then you obviously have the insecurity of a child dealing with their mother and not getting their approval, which is what Icarus is.
Yep.
And then you have everyone else on the team that is devastated by the loss. Cersei having to rise to the challenge of like stuff being thrust upon her. And like it just was frustrating to see when you have this cast of really interesting characters with different abilities, that you have one that's just like healer. And it's the same with like video games for me. When you have something that is just solely there to exist to heal other things, it's not as interesting.
So let's go quickly through the list of the rest of them, because it's basically the other main characters. Icarus, or Icarus, is basically he can fly, he has laser vision in terms of the movie. He's also very
Superman.
strong. Yeah, basically a Superman. There's Fastus, who in terms of, I couldn't find very much on him in terms of the comics, but in terms of the movie, he basically
He's an inventor.
yeah, he can create things,
Is what
but
Hephaestus
mechanically
would have been based off of.
Yeah, exactly. I really like that.
Yes.
We have Makari, who's
Speedster.
apparently one of the fastest characters in the Marvel universe, which I liked.
Makes sense.
And yep, that's it.
No, there's Sprite, Druid, and Gilgamesh,
Which-
but we talked about Gilgamesh already.
Yeah.
Okay, this is spoilers for the movie, so if you want to earmuffs for a little bit, or just skip past this part, it'll be like a minute. The events of the movie are pretty darn similar to the events that actually happen with these characters. Like Druid is the one who
He
breaks off from the rest of them and just
he wanted to rule Earth at one
yeah,
point.
exactly. That is comic true as well. There is a separation of all these characters who like start betraying each other and like break apart. A lot of the events of the movie very directly correlate with how their personalities are.
Mm-hmm.
But then there's things that are like you said, like Fastos is like it's just like left out.
Yeah.
And there are like these prime Eternals, but again, another big difference from the movie is that there was a lot of them, and then they fought with each other and they got reduced. In the movie, it was like,
These are
hey,
it. For,
we made like 9 or like whatever,
Well,
like
on
11.
this planet,
yes. And then there's Eternals that spread throughout the universe. And it's like
right. Well, and
The
they
fact that
do
you guys-
kind of talk about that.
just the fact that they keep talking about like they keep going like robots. It's like you guys are ruining the image of what these are.
yeah.
By consistently showing them throughout the movie being robotic. And,
And
like
I think also it hurts because the Celestials also, like just Arishem in general, looks very robotic
okay.
too.
So actually,
except for
interesting.
his eyes. He looks
got
like he's
6
crafted out of stone.
Which is by the way, the funny thing is the imagery of Arishem is actually a different Eternal in the or a different Celestial in the comics.
yeah, also there's a new Guardians of the Galaxy game. I played through it, really fun. But anyways, there is that Nowhere. The Celestial there looks very different from the one that's in Guardians of the Galaxy the movie. The one in Guardians of the Galaxy movie looks like Arishem.
Yeah.
It has 6 dots
6
for eyes.
Yeah.
While the one in the video game, because the video game is based on the comics, not the movies, so it has a lot of comic book lore scattered throughout it. The face looks a little bit more, like spherical? It has a lot more, like it's a lot less blocky, and it has a lot more like smoothness to it, but still has 6 dots for eyes. And I'm
So-
like, cool.
Yeah.
little thing off my dome.
Yeah.
Potentially, maybe, and I don't know if that's what they were planning to do or if they'll do in the future, but in my head, with the information from the movie that we've got so far, and based off the research we did based on the comics, it would actually make sense that Arishem decided to show Cersei those images that made them seem more robotic to limit her perception of freedom of choice. Because if she perceives herself as a construct, then she's more likely to admit that she has no choice about the situation, what she's being told. Whereas, like, what if they are actually more human derived and they aren't built in the sense that they show in the movie?
Which makes sense. They kind of are, the whole aspect of it is the control
Which
element.
has to do with this one element, the biggest element that makes it strange for the movie, that they're a construct instead of more of an organic, like, more of a humanist, like, made character. You know, it's an organic character instead of, like, a construct. Is the fact that Thanos is an Eternal that was mixed with a Deviant at some point, which
has
is why
a deviant gene.
yes, which is why he's purple instead of like everybody's pale complexion.
Correct. And that's why, because they introduced at the end that
Spoiler, earmuffs.
that Star Fox and or is it Sky Fox? I can't
Star
remember.
Fox.
Star Fox and Thanos are brothers and related, and they were born, obviously, because they're brothers, they were born of something.
They can't
that
be brothers without them being born.
Wait. So is Star Fox Eros?
No.
Are those the same character?
No.
No.
Okay.
That leads me to believe that Arishem showed Cersei false images of them
Especially
being android
with her walking down, like all of these individuals that look robotic, and when they die, they get all these cool symbols, which doesn't necessarily mean the robots.
Yeah.
So
No.
I enjoyed that because then the deviants were mutating throughout it, which wouldn't make too much sense if they're robots. Like, that doesn't make any sense.
Well, and even still, the
deviants are literal organic creatures.
yeah.
So I'm hoping you're right, Corey, with that. Is that was a misinformation play for them, and then they can redirect themselves in a future movie? Because it doesn't make sense that Thanos and Star Fox are brothers if they're constructs.
Yeah.
Especially because of like everything Thanos has done and everything, how integral he is to the MCU.
Well, like I said, the Eros also says specifically he's the brother of Thanos, and Eros it is a human being looking thing too.
Yes, and
So
so we can all hope that that's what's going on.
to kind of round out this discussion, though, how did you? So let's go pros and cons. For one, with all the previous reviews of this movie's getting in the negative aspect, I don't understand it because it was a solid movie.
Critics specifically,
Yeah.
negative from
Reviewers
critics,
specifically.
mostly positive from people.
Yeah,
Critics aren't people.
And I enjoyed the movie. I thought overall I had my gripes with it, and we'll go over that after. But I thought it was very entertaining, and definitely you should go see it.
Yeah. Unlike a couple other movies I've seen in the past week, my biggest issue was that robot thing, but everything else with it was really good. I liked it. I think it was a solid 8 out of 10 movie. But beyond that, it felt so out of place in
Yeah,
the
it definitely
MCU right now. It just felt like, hey, we're dropping this little bit of a movie that's really interesting, but it seems just like way out of left field for just being not the right time to produce this movie or bring it out. Otherwise, it was really exciting, and also got me to research who these characters are and where they're coming from. So I enjoyed it in that way.
So I think out of all of us, I'm the one who is the worst movie rater. Mainly
It's
because
11 out of 10.
if I don't have any preconceived notions of the thing, I'll go in and watch that movie and I'll be like, that was entertaining. I like that because they did what they did because they did that and they could.
Yeah.
And I just go along for the ride, and if I enjoy it and stay awake, then it's a good movie. But I think to do with your guys' criticisms, I think yours was the biggest you mentioned to me was pacing.
Yeah, which I'm going to talk about after.
But yours, Michael, to do with like it seems out of place with the universe. For me, I don't have as much of a criticism to do with that because obviously with Endgame, they just ended that entire lead up that the main core Marvel movies have been building for 10 years now? Over 10 years. So it makes sense to drop something now where it's like,
Where it
now
feels
this
out of
feels
place.
new and
Yeah.
out of place because it's going to be kicking off the next sort of section of movies where it's like, this is the origin that predates even the other Marvel stuff that
Yeah.
we've done.
Yeah.
It links into the Marvel stuff that we just finished because they mentioned Thanos.
Yeah.
And they're going to bring in a lot more of the B cast, obviously with Dark Knight, I think you said.
Black Knight.
Black Knight, which is really interesting. So they have a bunch of tie-ins. If, obviously, another spoiler, I found out and was very pleasantly surprised that the voice that speaks to Kit Harington behind him is the new actor of Blade. At first, I thought that was Nick Fury, but I was very wrong.
We all did at the end of the movie.
But
Oh, deep voice.
Yeah.
so, like, I'm actually more excited about their B-list characters because they can. First of all, I don't like when they have big name celebrities do characters because I much prefer when they take new celebrity, kind of like what they did with Tom Holland, right?
Yeah.
Like when you have a new celebrity come in and they really take the mantle of that character, they can build it really strong. But with those B characters, they kind of have more freedom in what direction they take. So I'm looking forward to Dark Knight. I'm looking forward to Blade.
Black Knight. Yes.
Yep. I'm just going to say Dark Knight because it feels weird.
It's not
saying
Batman.
Hey, DC confirmed.
It's not Batman.
Well,
Yeah.
I love that too, how there are also like multiple
Oh, yeah.
times they mentioned
Superman.
Superman.
Well, and that's the thing. I'm there's articles that are like, oh, DC Universe confirmed. I'm like, well, we're basing the fact that the Marvel Universe is just this universe, minus the fact that Marvel is real people, not comics. Even though there are comics of these characters inside that universe.
Yeah. So there also might be DC comics in the Marvel universe.
Yeah,
Of course.
And people are watching, movies of Superman,
Yeah.
and so that's
Okay.
why.
So to finalize it, you gave your gripe.
Yeah.
My biggest thing, as we kind of just touched on, is pacing.
Yeah.
I felt like this movie would have made an amazing TV series because it would have given it enough time to not only flesh out certain things, give you enough time to be emotionally invested in characters, and that way a lot of things that happened you would have been a lot more emotionally involved in.
In addition to that, they could have better explained the Deviants in Eternals instead of just using the Deviants as a throwaway villain. 'Cause
Yeah.
that's what it felt like they did.
Definitely. So there's definitely flaws associated with this, and I think it would have made an absolutely amazing TV show. And it's unfortunate that they chose movie medium because they were restricted by time.
Yeah.
Well,
However, I still loved it, and it was still great, and it was fun and entertaining.
and I could say we all enjoyed it.
Yeah.
Definitely.
Yeah.
So Corey, your normal outro?
Yeah. If you can hit whatever is the bell icon to remind you when we have our releases. If you can hit whatever is liking, we like that. We do.
We like likes.
And yeah, let us know
Like
if
our
you
likes.
have if you've seen the Eternals and you have a different spin, or if we've included any information or you have any information that is different to what we've had.
That we casually
Yeah.
missed out.
Yeah.
And we are eternally yours, generally casual.